You can cry and cry until your eyes are red. You can toss and tumble on a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your time trying to lose the blues. Lose the blues, lose the blues. You can walk the streets through the lonely night. You can tell yourself that everything's alright, but you're wasting your time trying to lose the blues. The blues, the blues. Well, you got that someone on your mind, those memories.
Hello. Welcome to, is it episode 12, Martin?
It is episode 12 and of It's Your Time You're Wasting, and welcome to tonight's Waste of Time.
Yes, we've got a bit of a packed show tonight. We've got 4 interviews. Martin, tell us who we've got.
Well, we've got with you Jonathan Mountstevens coming up first, I believe, and then Patrick Alexander from Inspiration Trust.
Right.
And then Ed Clarke, who's going to be an interesting interview. And who have you got? 2 others?
Yes, David Bott and Jared Horvath, who beamed in this morning to chat to, well, for me in the morning, for them late at night from Melbourne, to talk about their book 10 Things That Schools Are Doing Wrong. So that was a really great interview, which we're only going to see a snippet of tonight. And as always, Martin, if you subscribe to the channel, you will be notified when the full interviews are released in the week. So if you haven't already subscribed, do it now.
And we have a special guest, I think, as well. Have we got our special guest out there?
Yes, we've got a few. We've managed to record a few brief words from the Prime Minister. So if we can go straight to that, that would be wonderful.
No, of course. After Brexit, we're going to have volleyball playing women with very large breasts and curvaceous cucumbers no longer encumbered by the European Union. No, of course. After Brexit, we're going to have volleyball playing women with.
There we go. Boris Johnson, ladies and gentlemen.
It's when you see the whole interview. If you do subscribe, you'll see it come out during the week. He does a wonderful set of impressions, including an excellent Margaret Thatcher, to especially celebrate the beginning of The Crown this week, which is, of course, Catherine Birbalsing's favourite programme, if you remember.
Yes, it is. So that's at least one reason to start watching it if you haven't already. She said it was her favourite programme, but I understand now that topping the list is It's Your Time You're Wasting.
Of course. I should have thought of that, of course.
No, I know. Okay. Well, so let's go to our first interview. It's with Jonathan Mountstevens, who's a deputy head teacher and a history teacher in St Albans. And earlier in the week, he put out a tweet about his irritation with the way history is being used to justify various opinions. But let's hear from the man himself. So I'm delighted to be speaking to Jonathan Mountstevens, a history teacher and deputy head at Beaumont School in St Albans, about how the subject of history is being dragged into culture wars. And Jonathan, you put up on Twitter in the week a really interesting and well thought through series of tweets about just what's bugging you. Could you give us a bit of an overview of your irritation?
Yeah, I'm sure. Nice to talk to you, David. This sort of has been bugging me for some time, I think, and there's been a combination, a number of things that have irritated me. And the specific thing this week, which kind of prompted the thread, was a letter sent by a group of Conservative MPs called, I think, the Common Sense Group, to the Daily Telegraph about a piece of research conducted by the National Trust, looking into the sort of links between some of their properties and slavery and colonialism. And for example, they showed that there were some links with Chartwell, for example. And one of the things that these MPs seemed to object to was that they felt that this research was kind of tarnishing the reputation of kind of national heroes like Winston Churchill, who obviously lived in Chartwell himself, and that kind of uncovering this stuff about its history sort of did damage to him as a national hero. And I think one of the things they said in this letter was that the National Trust was being coloured by cultural Marxist dogma. And I just don't think that the research that they conducted, I can't say whether the National Trust is coloured by cultural Marxist dogma. I'm not here to speak for the National Trust.
Yeah.
But it seemed to me entirely wrong-headed for them to be saying that this piece of historical research meant that. Simply because, for me, there's two questions there. And the first question is it reasonable for the National Trust to conduct historical research into the properties which it has in its portfolio? And the answer to that seems to me, yes. That seems to be entirely appropriate and part of its remit. And obviously, it presents findings from that historical research in the form of, guidebooks and maps and human guides who will provide information at those properties, and that for me enriches the experience of visiting some of them. So it seems to me that it was completely appropriate for it to be doing that research. And secondly, the other important question is, were the findings of that research accurate? And it doesn't seem to me that anybody is disputing that these properties did indeed have links with slavery and colonialism. So to me, then, I couldn't see what the problem was with this particular piece of research. So why suppress it? And it did very much seem to me that that's what these MPs were keen to do, to suppress some historical research and say that it should never have been done, it should never have been published. And what I thought was particularly ironic is they were accusing in that letter the National Trust of sanitising history. And it just seemed to me that they were the ones sanitising history. They were doing completely the opposite, because they were essentially saying that these aspects of our past, we don't like them. They don't suit us. They're uncomfortable. They don't promote the kind of we want. Sorry?
They're unsanitary.
Absolutely, they're unsanitary. We need to sort of cleanse them. And it seemed to me that that therefore that accusation really should have been directed at themselves. And it's that specific event that prompted my thread. I guess the question then is, since I don't work for the National Trust or speak for the National Trust, I am a member and I like National Trust properties, but why did that bother me so much? I suppose that's what I'm a history teacher. And as a history teacher, what interests me, I'm passionate about young people learning about the past in all its complexity. So it seems to me that kind of when people try to suppress historical research because they don't like its findings, that is a threat to public knowledge of history, and therefore that's a threat to my profession, and I'm just not prepared to stand for that. So I suppose that's where the thread came from.
Certainly when I was at school studying history, we didn't study anything to do with the British Empire. And I think there was perhaps a period where we as educators maybe felt quite ashamed about Britain's role in the world. And rather than examining that, we just avoided it. And that some people might argue that now it's a particularly apposite time to teach the British Empire in all its faults, with all the things that it did which may be positive, but there's lots of much more negative stories out there which many people will be familiar with. And that if we try and give an honest appraisal, this happened, these things that this tiny island went out and sort of felt they had the right to govern the lives of people on all sorts of different continents. And I think maybe that helps explain to students in schools who might not feel represented by the curriculum, might feel, everyone around, the history they're learning about seems to be disproportionately white. It might help explain, how did my family come to this country? It might sort of provide the context to make that link, as long as we are suitably critical of Britain's role in world history. Does that seem like a sensible option to you, Jonathan?
Yes, I think so. I think, history acting in some sense as a mirror can be very empowering for people. And so, I don't come from an ethnic minority background. I come from a white British background. But for me, when, there were aspects of my sort of family background and so on, that when I remember coming across things in history that kind of resonated with me, that was extremely empowering, and kind of I wanted to know more about them, and it kind of went beyond just I've got an essay to do, I need to hand it in, and it became something that I just wanted to know about because that was empowering and interesting and fascinating, and I kind of lapped it up and couldn't know enough. And that's a good thing, and where we can do that in the curriculum, that's lovely. I would stress again, the constraints are quite extreme, and we can't possibly ensure that everybody can look in a mirror and see their own kind of past, if you like, in the curriculum. And I think we also need to be careful that, you know, it's lovely that I had that experience, that's great, and that had quite a profound impact on me as a person, but I would still draw a distinction between saying, I'm not convinced that was the purpose of the history study that was made available to me. The fact that that it had that impact, that's great and it's lovely, and it may well do that, but it's still valid historical study, regardless of whether it sort of provides that kind of personally empowering experience. So definitely, that I've lost my thread now. You asked me the second part of that question. I forgot now what it was, but I think that's lovely where it happens, but it doesn't always happen, and that doesn't make the history bad if a person isn't represented in.
Jonathan, I think that was very clear. I think we've come to, you know, we've navigated through some tricky waters there, and I hope that people watching this will, you know, feel that they're able to contribute to an ongoing discussion. And if anyone out there wants to argue against Jonathan's position, we'd love to hear from you and see what you've got to say. But thanks ever so much, Jonathan, for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, there you go. So we missed out some of the middle sections on that, where we talked a little bit about decolonising the curriculum and the fact that there are both people on the right and people on the left who are using history in this ideological, politicised way. But it was a great interview. Jonathan Mountstevens, somebody to follow on Twitter if you don't already.
I suppose it's quite ironic that we're discussing these issues in a show with 7 white guys all together today. So that's quite something we've managed to do there.
We can do we'll try harder. We did try and interview various other people, and it just didn't pan out this week. And the white men were just queuing up. So there we are.
Have a look overall. If you go to our YouTube site, you'll see lots of people there from every sex, every gender, or but every color, every race. I mean, obviously not, but we do try to get a range of people.
And not only that, Martin, I think we really try to represent a diversity of opinion, which is probably more important than, you know, the identity of the person holding the opinion. But fascinating interview that you did with a representative. We tried to get Rachel de Souza, and she sent a henchman instead to talk about Inspiration Trust. And people might not know, but a few years ago, Inspiration Trust was very much sort of set out its stall as quite a traditional multi-academy trust, and they recruited all sorts of big names from the Twitter sphere who were perhaps on the traditional side of the educational split. And then that's more recently that's changed, and that's something you probed into in your interview. Is that right, Martin?
Yeah, it's interesting point, because what I saw on Twitter was about a conference Inspiration had arranged, and Rachel tweeted out a tweet saying about we become more progressive, if you like.
Yeah.
So I can't remember the tweet exactly, but it sort of mentioned progression within there and being progressive, more progressive. So I think traditional plus a bit of progressiveness, etc., etc. And then the conference itself was tweeted out as time went by, and it was a really interesting number of tweets that caused quite a lot of debate, shall we say, on areas of Twitter. So the interview with Patrick, we addressed that, and we also addressed lots of other things that they're doing in Inspiration Trust now. And I think it's a really fascinating and wide-ranging interview. And of course, you'll get a first, I think, 10 minutes of it now. And please do subscribe, and you'll see the rest of it during the week.
Brilliant. Thank you. Let's go to that now, Martin.
Oh, no, of course. After Brexit, we're going to have...
And we're going to waste some time now. Patrick Alexander over at Inspiration Trust. Patrick, how the devil are you?
I'm very well, Martin. How are you?
I hope I'm all right. It's lovely. It's the weather over here is a bit grey at the moment, but hopefully it'll brighten up later. You're at Inspiration Trust. There's been a few changes there over the past few months or so. We'll talk about those in a bit. But tell me, what's your role over there?
So I started a couple of months ago. I'm the new director of curriculum and teacher development.
And that's very I like the full stop there. That caught me somewhat by surprise. Sorry about that. Tell me about this role.
So the trust invested in curriculum, or started to invest in curriculum quite heavily a few years ago. And so there has always been a director of education or curriculum or similar. And so, but I think this version of the role is slightly different, and it encompasses teacher development as well. So it's about bringing those two aspects together into one area of responsibility.
And where were you before?
So I was in teacher development at Teach First. So I was working in schools across London in initial teacher training, and yeah, I did a couple of years there. So that sort of fed into the teacher development aspect here at Inspiration.
And you're an English teacher by trade?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm an English specialist. I trained through Teach First, taught in London for a while, then abroad for a couple of years, and then in sort of curriculum leadership roles in English in a couple of schools in London for 6 years, then as a head of English, and then as a freelance consultant. And
it's run by a dame, isn't it? Dame Rachel de Souza.
Inspiration is, yes. Dame Rachel de Souza is our great leader, yes.
And there are schools all over, mainly Norfolk, I believe. And I've certainly visited a couple in Norwich there.
That's right, yes.
A couple in Suffolk, is that right? Or is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And tell me, do you know how many schools there are in the trust, or is that too much of a...
14.
Well done. It's the factual questions, you see. So it's good to see you retaining the knowledge and able to bring it out like, well done. Now, there's been some changes we were talking about, because Inspiration Trust was famous or notorious for an episode a couple of years ago, which I'll call the bucket full of sick episode. It's not quite like that. A bucket of sick, not bucket full. Bucket to be sick in. Let's get this absolutely right. Bucket to be sick in, next to a child or something like that. I mean, it was all sorts of, I suppose, the press getting hold of something and running with it. Quite a lot of that. But tell me, things have changed somewhat. That was the past. This is the future. Tell me.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm familiar with that headline. You know, and I think it would probably be unwise for me to talk a lot about it, because this really happened before I started. You know, I know that it was probably a kind of an expression of an attempt to have a no excuses sort of approach to behaviour, and to really focus on making sure that lessons were accessible for everybody, as much as possible, and I think that's how I understand it looking back. But I think that is part of the past, and looking forward, I suppose, yeah, we have made some changes which we announced at a conference just before half term. And I guess we're working quite hard on inclusion and equality at the moment. So it's about, I don't think that was a particularly helpful headline. I'm not sure if it was particularly kind of fair depiction of what was necessarily happening in that context. But certainly gave us pause for thought. And I think what's really nice is we've had an opportunity to think about our identity. And what we stand for, and that has led to the creation of some principles which really bind together our thinking about that for the years ahead. Okay, so
when you say no excuses, I take it you're not having a policy of excuses now necessarily, but it's something that I think Dame Rachel herself tweeted before half term about moving from traditional to progressive, which obviously two words that resonate in quite a lot of debates on Twitter, certainly, if not edu Twitter at least. Can you tell me what she might have meant by that?
Well, I think it's important to be completely clear about what she tweeted. I mean, I can't quote the tweet verbatim, but I think what she said was she wanted to reclaim the word progressive rather than moving from traditional to progressive. And of course, it's a bit of a, you know, it's a live rail in the debate. You know, it's a word which has all sorts of associations. But ultimately, I think what we're trying to do is move away from unhelpful binaries. You know, and I was really, you know, I've always felt for a long time in education, you know, I've been in education in some shape or form since 2005, that some of the language around pedagogy and curriculum is unhelpful and polarizes debate. And, you know, that kind of leads to sort of enormous pendulum swings in policy, some of which have been really important. So I think that the reforms, the huge sort of waves of reform that we've seen over the last 10 years, a lot of them have been were necessary, welcome, in terms of thinking about knowledge, in terms of thinking about pedagogy. But the problem with, you know, polarization and binaries is that it means that, you know, if you only think in those terms, then there's very little room for subtlety, nuance, and, you know, what you might end up with is a kind of, and I think this is possibly something which we try to think about in our principles, is an overcorrection of one way of thinking, let's say progressive, to another way of thinking, which is traditional or neo-traditional. Now, the problem with, as I say, with that way of thinking is it tends to create kind of sort of violent changes in policy. And I think, you know, when Rachel said she wanted to reclaim the word progressive, you'd have to ask her what she means by that. But you know, for me, I think the important thing to emphasize is that if you just hammer away at these, you know, words like traditional, then you're going to get quite a static interpretation of what we're doing in schools. And, you know, given some of the, you know, the cultural debates we've been having in society, you know, I think it's timely to consider what being purely traditional would really mean in a school's context and what some of the implications of that are. You know, because it's kind of unfortunate the word progressive has had some of the associations it's had in education, because we still want, even if we don't want to use the word progressive, because, you know, in sort of 2008, let's say, it meant a purely discovery learning approach with lots of, you know, group work and brain gym and funny hats and plasticine and all the rest of it. You know, I think now when we're thinking about the ideas about progress in society, it feels unfortunate that we can't use the word progressive in an education context. So I think that's probably what Rachel was driving at. But, you know, again, you'd have to ask her.
Yeah, of course. In terms of progressive as an ideal and tradition as an ideal, I suppose I could see that you could get caught in that binary and say we are a progressive education institution or we are a traditional institution, and those two things. But do the two things sit well together as ideas, or I mean, is there an inherent contradiction there? I'll perhaps give you an example over the National Trust, you know, that where the debate perhaps is being had in all sorts of institutions, whether it's the BBC or the American elections, whatever it happens to be, there is this tension, and whether an institution can marry these things together easily or not is in itself an interesting question.
Yeah, and I think that's why we've come up with these principles, which I think we'll come on to later, because inherent in the design of these principles is an acknowledgement of that tension. You know, the structure of the principles both state, for example, in curriculum terms, that we are very much, our thinking is driven by knowledge, the importance of knowledge, teaching knowledge, powerful knowledge, but also acknowledging that that's not necessarily a fixed idea. It's important to think about what a canon is, what has been canonical, what may be canonical. I mean, it's impossible to predict what's going to be canonical in the future, but at least acknowledging the importance of debate about these things. So there's a sort of elasticity or a flexibility in our principles, which should allow some more sophisticated thinking than perhaps might have been the case before. And that's not to say that we weren't able to think in a nuanced way before that, but I think trying to articulate it has felt important. And you've just given some really good examples of contexts where a consideration of those sort of polarizing words needs to be like bound together in some way. And so it's really interesting work.
And you had a conference just before half term, and you were looking at a variety of issues. Again, this was seen on social media. Some of the stuff was put out there. Can you tell me how that went and what was the thinking behind it?
Yeah, so the theme was equality. I think the year before was inclusion, and it was just a really good opportunity for us to get together as a group of schools and consider that word, what we're doing to try and make sure that we are creating the best possible opportunities for students in our trust. Hear from a range of speakers about issues to do with diversity, to do with curriculum, to do with behaviour, to do with making sure that everyone can access the curriculum that we're delivering, and also to reflect on who we are as a trust, and some of this new thinking that we've been putting into our principles and policy writing, and sort of a general review of where we're at and assessing our strategy for the next few years. So yeah, I think that's it.
There we go.
And treading carefully, really concerned and thought about what he was going to say next. It's a great shame that we couldn't get Rachel herself to tell us what she meant. As Patrick said, you'll have to ask her. Well, we did try. But Martin, there's a lot more in that interview. Do you want to sort of summarise some of the other things that you?
I think there's a lot of connections with what Jonathan was talking about as well, and this is, how do we create some sort of balance between the idea of this is what we stand for. This is, I suppose, flag, nation, or, curriculum, canon, all these sort of big ideas, and then ideas around how do we critique, how do we challenge, how do we make things perhaps slightly different to reflect the modern age that we now find ourselves in. And of course, a lot of this has come about because of various positions people take on the culture wars, to give it the shorthand that a lot of people give it.
Right, and it was I felt very old when he said he'd been in education since 2005. There we go. Well, things move on, and I think, don't they say about the police that when they look younger than you are, you're old. You went directors of curriculum.
You're much younger than me, so just to think how I feel.
I know. I dread to think how you're still operating, Martin.
I know it's. At least I'm sitting down.
Well, that's a relief. Good. Okay. And I'm a bit worried about you sitting outside that distressed-looking wall there. Get yourself inside and get a hot meal.
I know, I'm not allowed in. Not allowed in.
The wonders of technology. Well, okay. So do subscribe, and the full interview with Patrick Alexander will be released in the week. And as a sort of an advance warning, we're hoping to have an interview with an ex-employee of Inspiration Trust next week to give us their take on the story at
This is
Inspiration.
news to me. So
Ah,
we'll see what happens
it's
there.
not. You're just saying that, Martin. It's not you, you big liar.
No.
Right. No,
Um,
we're going to talk to Barry Smith, and he'll tell us what he's doing now and what he did in the past. Okay, so also he popped back in at the beginning of that interview. Ed Clarke. You've also been talking to Ed Clarke this week, and
Ed's talking. We're talking here the difference between tradition and progress. We're showing some sort of a perhaps debate between the two and how schools are dealing with it. And with Ed's a traditionalist teacher all the way, so much so that he teaches Latin, which I suppose you can't get more traditional a subject than that. And he's talking about his Latin teaching and also his approach to other things. And as I said, you won't get them in this interview, perhaps, but no, you certainly won't get it in this interview, actually. But at the end of the interview, which again, if you look out for it during the week, he does some wonderful impressions as well. So you
definitely worth catching that in the week. So
you
people
get a
really
huge amount for your money.
We might even release those as a short because it's such good value. But anyway, let's roll VT and listen to Martin's interview with Ed.
And now we're going to waste some time with Ed Clarke, or as you can see with his little moniker there, Clarke's Latin, which might give you a small insight into what he might be talking about. Ed, how the devil are you?
I'm well, thank you, and surviving the corona apocalypse, I think.
Ed, tell our viewers a bit about yourself. You're a teacher and you're a Latin teacher. Tell me, how did you get to where you are now?
I started out tutoring. That was in fact, just before I went to university, I began doing a spot of tutoring. And I taught in the end all through doing my classics degree at Nottingham. I was up north for university, or at least as up north as I've ever been. So I started teaching then, and then I graduated in 2012, and I taught a couple of years at Cranleigh at a senior school. But ultimately, I was interested, I suppose, in the prep school level, because it gives you an opportunity to start the language from the very beginning and to really to get the kids doing what you want them to do, to approach the language in an analytical way and so forth right from the start, rather than picking up off, as it were, where somebody else has left them, if you see what I mean. So I started teaching at Highfield, where I still am in 2014. So I'm still head of classics there, and I have since I've been on the committee which has created the new common entrance classics specification. That's for ISEB, the Independent Schools Exam Board. So I've helped to create the new common entrance, and in a sense, I've created a whole load of resources in the shape of Clarke's Latin to go with it. I'm also the IAPS Classics Advisor. I do their conferences each year. I've done keynote Latin conferences as well, and I've written in the Spectator and the TES and a few other bits and pieces. And I guess I campaign for traditional knowledge-based sort of old school teaching, I would suggest.
And you don't get much more old school than Latin, I suppose. Can you just you threw an acronym at me, an acronym.
Did I?
IAPS.
Oh yes, that's the Independent Association of Prep Schools, which it makes me laugh a little at my old prep school, which was quite all very Evelyn Waugh. I was at Milbourne in the late 90s, and the headmaster was a man called Norman Hale, who was head for 51 years. He went from 1948 to 1999. And I think was in his 80s when I got to the school. So he was quite a formidable character. He once picked me up by the hair because I didn't know the difference between Oro I beg and Ora the shore, which I've subsequently never forgotten. But I think we were thrown out of IAPS in the 90s because he wouldn't allow inspections. And he felt that inspectors were just there to look at the plumbing and he would escort them from the premises. But I think they've since been welcomed back into the fold.
Is he? I won't ask if he's still there, but
he did retire a couple of years after.
I see. That might be something to do because violent Latin is a certain approach that some people do swear by, of course. Now, this is something I keep saying to people when they ask me about curriculum content, and I say Latin's not for posh people. And I'm suddenly thinking, actually, this interview might be proving the opposite. Is Latin for posh people?
Well, I mean, it's one of the issues, really, that if you wind up being a classicist, more likely than not, you've been privately educated, because unfortunately the bulk of the Latin and Greek teaching that goes on certainly does tend to be in the private system, and that is a really sad thing. And it's been wonderful seeing groups like Classics for All cropping up and trying to expand it into the state system. I did go and speak at the East London Science School a couple of years ago, and they've got a wonderful classics department, and the kids were very clued up. I gave a talk on ancient history for them. So I think with some of the new academies and free schools and that sort of thing, a degree of classics has come back in. There's been a minor renaissance in recent years, I would suggest. But it is still rather the preserve of the private sector, which is definitely a shame, because there's just so much to offer in its own right and in terms of backing up other subjects as well.
It's an interesting point as well that some state schools are moving towards a classics curriculum, but not going the whole hog with Latin or ancient Greek or doing the language as such. Mm-hmm. So some bring it in at lunchtime or after school as a sort of club activity. And where does it belong, out of interest? Do you think it belongs in a languages department or in a ancient history classics department, perhaps?
A little of both, I suppose. I mean, it's whenever anybody discusses, and I hate this word, cross-curricularity, and the links between various departments. I tend to say that really it's not for Latin to show its links with everything else. It's for everything else to show how it comes from Latin. I mean, so many of the subjects on the curriculum have connections with the ancient world, and I think you always have to proceed on both fronts. There was an attitude in years gone by that ancient history or classical civilization was a bit sort of Roman domestic science, and that the languages were the proper stuff. And I'm happy to say that I think these days it's a much more broad business than that. In fact, I'm quite excited that one of the changes we've been able to make with Common Entrance is the introduction of a classical civilization paper, which we didn't have before. There was a little section at the end of Latin on Class Civ, and we've now got it as a subject in its own right. But I think it can sit comfortably in either of those worlds. It's wonderful if people are able to study the language, whether that's ideally on timetable, but as a club or whatever. Schools do make that work. But equally, it's very much at home with its links to history, and of course our own history in terms of Rome and Britain.
Now, where you do a lot of work for what not in prep schools, but so for in the state sector, sort of primary age and key stage 3, I suppose.
Yeah, our kids sometimes will leave at the end of year 6 and go to senior schools that then start at year 7. But most of our kids will end in year 8 and then start public schools in the beginning of year 9. So yes, we bridge primary and the beginning of secondary, I suppose, which is it's a good age range really for, in terms of the mind being a sponge at that point in time. I think that, once you get into proper teenagerhood, you become a bit of a write-off for between then and A levels. Whereas I think up to the age of 13, they're beginning to get a bit teenagery by the end. But the minds are very good at soaking up information. And I certainly I've benefited hugely from that myself, having gone to a very old-fashioned prep school that was very rigorous academically. So, for example, most of my teaching these days is Latin. I tutor a bit of Greek, but I haven't taught it full-time for many years now. which is a shame, and it means that my Greek sometimes gets a bit rusty. But as soon as I pick it up again, suddenly my mind will go luamai, lue, luatai, luamatha, lueste, luontai, or whatever. It's all there because I learned it at age 11 or 12. I think I will probably end up taking it to the grave. You know, it's all inbuilt. So it's a fun time to teach in that sense, because they really do pick things up and then go on to apply them at senior schools, and we hear nice things back from the senior schools about how they're getting on, which is very rewarding.
Because it is also for teenagers, of course.
Oh, very, very, very much so.
Yeah.
And I mean, indeed, it's funny to think, I mean, I sat my scholarship, I'm now 30, so I sat my scholarship exam for senior school 17 years ago. I can still set the papers from that era. You know, nothing much has changed in the last 20 years in terms of the standard that's required, which is about AS level, I suppose, for Latin. So it's jolly difficult still. All of those kind of Eton, Westminster, kind of that standard is still very, very high. With, I might add, a fraction of the teaching time that I had when I was a kid. You know, we had a huge amount of Latin on the timetable, which doesn't tend so much to be the case these days. So it can be a bit of a challenge, but it's still a very high standard that's reached for us, age 13.
Now, you came across. Sorry, I came across you recently about the Latin primer that you've put together. Now, when I was at school, I did a year of Latin that was very disappointing in a state school that used to be a grammar school, so a comprehensive, and it all fell apart very quickly. But I remember doing Cambridge Latin, so it was all Caecilius, and I forget the other names. What's your opinion of Cambridge Latin?
I must admit, perhaps reluctantly, to being a skeptic when it comes to the Cambridge Latin course, and it was principally really because of it that I started writing my own resources. I published my first book, Variatio, some years back now, in 2015. I'd written it in my early 20s because I wanted, I guess, the guiding principle of Variatio, and subsequently the books that I've written recently, was that I always wanted the student not only to know what the Latin in question meant, but why. Why is it that Caecilius est in horto, which is the legendary first line of the Cambridge Latin? We all know that it means Caecilius is in the garden, and that's quite self-explanatory. But why does it mean that? And I think it becomes immediately apparent for a bright and perceptive student looking at that phrase will say, okay, well, if I look up horto in the dictionary, I find that the Latin word for garden is a hortus. So why has it got an O on the end of it? Why is it in horto? How would it be different if it were in hortum? Why is the verb est in the middle of the sentence when usually verbs are relegated to the end of a Latin sentence? And you have all of these questions, which I fear go largely unanswered. And I think both of my parents studied with the CLC back in, I suppose, the early 80s for O-level. And both of them found the same thing, that they initially felt very confident about translating Latin. But when it actually came to doing their first O-level unseen translation, completely fell apart because essentially they didn't have the understanding of the workings of the language. So obviously that's a problem when it comes to actually having to translate stuff and knowing what you're talking about. But also, I think there is often a sense in modern education that in order to make something enjoyable, it needs to be simplified. And I think quite often the very opposite is true.
Talking around discovery at some point, because if I go into schools and I say, teach Latin is a great thing to teach, but of course there's not enough Latin teachers out there. So is there a way that, me with my 1 year Latin, and that was Cambridge Latin, and Caecilius est in horto is all I remember.
Yeah.
Can I pick up one of your books perhaps and give it a go?
Well, I would very much hope so. And I mean, loath though I am to embark upon a sales pitch for my books, a snip at $11.99 and available from the website. Thank you for aiding and abetting me in that. Yes, I mean, in point of fact, it is a consideration for me at school whether I'm happy to say that our numbers are growing at the moment. and we're expanding in certain year groups to extra sets. So there is a possibility in years to come that I may have to find myself an apprentice amongst our assistant teachers. But certainly, I like to think that the books are very methodical, obviously, for the children's benefit, but also I think any adult picking up the language would rattle through the first couple of volumes of Clarke's Latin pretty speedily. And certainly the rudimentary stuff, you're really dealing with OST must dissent, the 6 endings of the present tense, and a few noun cases in the first declension, but it's very limited. And of course, as I'm always talking about with the children, and they find it very interesting, there's so much English etymology that derives from Latin. We've got thousands and thousands of derivations, which are very helpful for remembering all of the vocabulary and that sort of thing.
Anyway, that should encourage you to take up Latin again, David.
When you say again, I actually did an A-level in classical studies, or which, as it was then, I think it's called classical civilization now, where we studied the classics in translation. Because obviously I'm a state school boy, I didn't have any of that posh stuff. But I have to say, Martin, I absolutely loved reading Tacitus, and what else did we do? We did the Orestar Aeschylus. We did a bit of Homer, obviously, which is superb, and I still love to this day. And I do feel that reading these, having access to these texts is a wonderful thing. Whether or not we have to speak the original languages, I don't know. But I am inspired by the historian Tom Holland, who a few years ago he did a translation of Herodotus. And he decided to learn ancient Greek in order to do this, which I have to say, my hat's off to Tom Holland, who is obviously a much better human being than I am. That was an unexpectedly. That was like slow radio on YouTube. Wasn't it? That was a lovely thing. Hey, Clarke, I've not come across him before, but I feel
he's well worth following on Twitter, and also he gave a good hat tip there to Classics for All, who are well worth contacting if your school or is interested at all in teaching any of, whether it be classical civilization or Latin or Greek indeed, or any other sort of particularly focus on that ancient time. And get in touch with them, because they've got loads of resources and also can supply teachers for free to state schools to fly the flag for the classics.
Excellent. My believe it or not, I mean, obviously I'm an oik that doesn't know any of this stuff, but my brother-in-law, currently deputy head at Harrow, about to take over as headmaster at St Edward's in Oxford, is a classicist. And I'm a little bit in awe of these people. They're a bit scary, aren't they? But anyway, lovely, fascinating interview. Thank you for that, Martin. And to round things off this week, we've got our interview with authors of a John Catt published book. We've got David Bott and Jared Horvath, who, as I said earlier, I spoke to this morning down under. So they were busy, knocking back the scotch after a hard day's work, and I was there just digesting my Alpen. But we talked about their book that they've co-written, 10 Things That Schools Are Getting Wrong. And it's a fascinating and, again, a wide-ranging interview. And we've got a little snippet here which talks about some bits about teacher expertise. But let's have a look at that now. Okay, so we've got Jared Cooney, Horvath, and David Bott, the co-writers of a great new book from John Catt, which is 10 Things Schools Get Wrong and How We Can Get Them Right. And I read through this last night, and I was thinking, I hadn't looked at it, full disclosure, and I was thinking, oh no, I've got to read this book in front of this interview. Oh, it's going to be a hard slog. And I was riveted. I found it compelling, and I went through it in one sitting. Loved it. Loads of things in there that I'd want to talk to you about. But tell me a little bit before we get going. How did you guys come to write this book together? What's the story behind the book?
Yeah, so I think David has been working in Melbourne forever. at a school down south, and I just moved here a while ago, and lo and behold, we knew each other existed. Like, I knew you were around, David. We just never met each other till one day I got to do a couple of sessions with the school, with the students there. And we just kept bumping it. After each session, we would sit there and BS a little bit, and he would always push me back. Didn't matter what I said. It could have been the best thing in the world. And he would have come up and said, yeah, but have you thought about this?
He's that
Maybe
guy.
you wanted to. He's that
True.
guy.
Well, it's because most of what you say is rubbish, Jared. That's why.
Yeah.
I had to just clarify things for you.
And I didn't know
So-
until you pointed out. So eventually you just keep talking. You talk over a couple of beers. You go over to each other's houses and you say, hey, and it was you. You said, do you want to write a book? I've got a title. And I go, absolutely. And then lay it out, and the rest is history.
Yeah. Yeah, I think these are. I've been in education been teaching for 15 years before I met Jared, and these kind of 10 things have been percolating for all of those years, and I'd never really had the impetus, the courage to put them into words. And I think with Jared's expertise around the learning science and the neuroscience, it just added a layer of sophistication to my kind of intuitive thinking around education. So it felt like a really a nice marriage, not a marriage in that way. Although, I shouldn't do it in public. Should I propose? No, but it did feel like a nice mix, a nice blend of our skills and backgrounds. So it was really fun to write.
Okay, so we've got these 10 things that schools are doing wrong. So they've been percolating in the back of your mind, David, for countless years. Jared comes along with his newfangled science and gives you intellectual permission for those ideas to take more shape. Let's go through and think about some of those ideas. So the first one, essentially, is that is about the profession of teaching, and while teaching meets various sort of ticks on what it means to be a profession, it fails on one particular count in that the experts who are at the forefront of deciding what teachers do don't tend to be teachers, and so teachers are, for instance, very underrepresented at education conferences, and that we rely on people from outside the profession to give us guidance on what we should be doing. Can you tell us a little bit about this as an idea?
Yeah, so and I think most teachers would recognize this is that those who can't do teach type of kind of concept where, hey, I've been to school, I know how to teach, I've worked with teachers, I know how to teach. And for so long, teachers have been seen as cogs in a wheel. And actually, I'm not making this up. I was at a government meeting a couple of years ago, and there were no teachers present at all at that meeting. There was researchers, neuroscientists, lawyers, politicians. And when I said, hey, why is there no teachers here? The explanation was because they're simply levers we're pulling. The kids are the ones we care about, and we're the ones making the decisions, and they're the ones who just have to make this stuff happen. And that's, I'm sorry, complete and utter nonsense to me. But I think they've been browbeaten for so long. So I was a teacher back in the day, so I recognize it from 20 years ago. You get browbeaten so long and told that the answer lies somewhere else that you stop looking to yourself for that answer, and you start waiting for the world to tell you what's the answer to teaching. Can you write a book that tells me do these 10 things, don't do these 10 things? And at the end of the day, if the one thing you take away from this book is that teachers, by the very definition of the word expertise, they are the experts at the craft of teaching. So the only answers we'll ever get about what teaching is, how it should work, how to do it best, has to come from them. Everyone else is just talking. Like, I could tell you about dentistry because I brush my teeth, but until I'm a dentist working on the ground 24/7, hopefully you don't trust me with any of that stuff. Yet that's what we tend to do with teaching.
Right. Okay. So David, if we accept that argument, it does seem, as you say, to chime with teachers' experience. What should we do? How do we solve the problem? How do we get teachers at the heart of the discussion about what teaching should look like?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's we want teachers to believe in themselves, and I think from what we've seen we argue really in the book that it's really that lack of belief in themselves that is the core problem here. And as Jared said, teachers spend 1,000 hours a year, face to face with students and build up this incredible skill set throughout their careers and a level of expertise that that no one else outside of the profession can have in that craft of being in front of students and delivering content and nurturing well-being and inspiring students. And so we feel that the starting point is for teachers to believe that they are experts, to know that they are experts, and then to create a system that enables the sharing, the collaboration, and the accumulation and dissemination of knowledge that comes from those experts. So collecting that knowledge base somehow, distributing it somehow, ensuring that we can all learn from each other, as you see in most other professions where there's a formalized process to share in the expertise of colleagues.
And can I jump on the back of that? I love that. 'Cause if you think about science, if you think about law, if you think about anthropology, it doesn't matter. Every field has a body of knowledge produced by, every professional field has a body of knowledge produced by the experts in that field. And that body of knowledge is very consistent. Everyone knows, so if you're an expert in that field, you know how to tap into it, you know how to find what you need. This is how we work science. It doesn't matter that there's a billion of us doing a billion different projects, because we have this consistent body of knowledge that we have to feed into, that everyone knows how to use and work. That's where we start to think, if teachers can find a way, and there's suggestions out there, we don't want to be the ones to say, do it this way, but how do you build that body of knowledge so that what you're doing all day, every day, you're always experimenting in your class. You don't have a bad class and come do the same thing tomorrow. You tweak, you change, you move. That's evidence. How do we just collate this evidence into some sort of useful body of knowledge that the experts know what it means, know how to use it, know how to work it? That's where we start getting that professionalism back.
Okay, and that sort of segues into the second section of your book about evidence. And one of the things that we've experienced over recent years in here in the UK is that I think with the advent of teachers taking to social media, they've found a voice, they found a mechanism to speak to other teachers, which didn't really exist before. And so I think because of that, we've seen movements like Research Ed, which I know has made it to Australia, where education researchers and teachers have been brought together, and the researchers talk about the research and the teachers talk about how they're applying it in classrooms, and that seems like a really healthy dialogue, and one which you appear, my reading of it is that you're really advocating in your book that when we cite evidence, the question that you would ask is, whose evidence is it? Is it evidence that comes from a psychology lab or from a neuroscience experiment, or is it evidence of how teachers have been using this stuff productively in classrooms?
And what you see is most people, you're spot on, most people will use the term evidence considering or assuming that it's a singular thing. Evidence is what fits in this box called science, till you realize that no, every field in the world has a very different definition of evidence. Lawyers, evidence is precedents. Go back to anthropologists, evidence is stories, is myths. No other field has to accept your evidence. It's the people, the experts who work within your field. So long as they agree this is evidence for us, this is what matters to us, then that becomes meaningful evidence for your field. And I think what a lot of these movements before Research Ed, and I think Research Ed is probably the best one to do this. Before that, it was a lot of, we have scientific research born in the laboratory, tell that to teachers, and then complain when they don't know how to use it, because our evidence is very different than what's meaningful evidence in a classroom. The numbers, the stats I have to crunch, the way I have to run my research in a lab isn't anywhere near what matters to a teacher. How do I run 30 year 5 kids on a Friday afternoon to try and teach them math? The two are just very separate, and we've been trying to shoehorn our evidence into your field forever. And now I think with Research Ed, that's when they said, okay, there's evidence here, but what is your evidence? What does this mean for you? And that's where we're going to get the juice. Have the teachers. That's what I love. Whenever a Research Ed conference comes up here and I look at the schedule and it's about 75 to 80% teachers instead of researchers, I'm like, that's it. There you go. It might sound crazy, but that's the step. The day I stop going to conferences to talk to teachers as a researcher is the day that teachers have stepped up. And although I might be shooting myself in the foot, that's what I'm really looking for.
You know, I could go on talking to you guys forever. I really want people to know, and I don't always say this, so I'm being really, really explicit. I enjoyed the book. I really valued reading it. It was a relatively quick read. I read it in one sitting in one evening. It's packed full of great stories, many of which we haven't even touched on. So, you know, even if you find that you don't agree with this, I'm speaking for you here, David and Jared, but I think you don't mind if people agree with you. You just want to sort of try and provoke deeper thought, don't you? And it certainly does that. So highly recommended. 10 Things Schools Get Wrong and How We Can Get Them Right by Dr. Jared Cooney, Horvath, and David Bott. Thanks so much for allowing me to waste so much of your time for you after the end of a long day in Australia, immediately in the morning. But brilliant. So thanks ever so much. And
no, thank you. You have a good Friday. It's our Friday night, so we can go have a scotch.
Yeah.
You now have to work today.
David, can I just say, David, thank you as well for all the work you're doing in highlighting educators from around the world. And, you know, sometimes work that's happening in Australia doesn't necessarily get to the UK and vice versa. So really appreciate how that you're providing a platform for educators around the world to share and to think deeply. So really appreciate all the work you're doing as well. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Okay, so well, there we are.
Hey,
we're appreciated, Martin.
We have a platform. Educators around the world.
Yeah, unite.
Well, now we're going to do. We have to go straight rushing in because we're reaching the end of the show. Rushing straight into the hat, I'm afraid.
Yes, we're giving away a couple of copies of Kate McAllister and James Mannion's book, Fear is the Mind Killer. We've got 2 copies to give away. The email address, as always, is hello@ something. Can we put it on the screen? Because I just have a mental block. I can't. There we are. hello@wastingyourtime.co.uk. Brilliant. So if we call your name, do get in touch and we'll send you a copy of James and Kate's book. And we're hopefully going to get back in touch with Kate and talk to her about her adventures in the Dominican Republic. But Martin, who's won the books?
We have, and I drew these earlier to save time. So it's no recounts, no Donald Trumpian need to recount this. This is all done.
I suspect it's a fraud.
We have Glam Buck, B-U-K, and Efrat First. Efrat First. So
Efrat and Glam, get in touch, and your copies of Fear is the Mind Killer will be winging their way to your clammy little hands. But thanks ever so much for your time and attention on this, the 12th episode of It's
Your Time You Wasted.
Wasting. Thank you very much. See you next week. Bye-bye.
You can cry and cry until your eyes are red. You can toss and tumble on a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your